فقدوا أو اختفوا في الأزمة الحالية أو في الأزمات السابقة. يشرفني اليوم أن أيسر هذا الملتقى وأعرف لجنة تنسيق السياسات في المجموعة السورية للمفقودين والتي نختصرها في PCG.
7 families of the missing, lawyers, representatives of CSOs and victim groups, as well as human rights groups. And this process is being facilitated by ICMP. The goal of the PCG, which will be discussed in more detail, is to come up with recommendations and policy frameworks specific to missing persons and the disappeared and detained in Syria. As a first activity of the PCG, the group developed the ethical charter, which we will discuss in more detail today, which is the subject of this virtual launch. So without further ado, I want to introduce my colleague, Nael Georges, who is the PCG moderator and researcher, and Nael will go ahead and discuss and introduce the ethical charter along with a number of other PCG members. Nael?
Thank you, Reem. بدوري سأتكلم باللغة العربية.
Hello everyone, I will speak in English. I would like to welcome all of you, and I would like to say that this charter talks about principles and code of conduct that has to do with that organizes the relationship with the families of the victims during the collection of information. I would like to say at the beginning that the members of the PSG members, 27 members, have chosen this topic as a priority, and they saw it to be the most appropriate to kick off the work of the PSG group. It's one of many topics that we will work on or that we have started working on, like the preparation or compiling a comprehensive review that has been submitted to the UN demanding the immediate release of Syrian detainees, stopping or suspending all acts of torture and killing inside detention centers, and a political settlement that would put an end to the violations committed or perpetrated by everyone and would pave the way for transitional justice. It is very important also to mention that this charter is a joint effort between all the PSG members, which created or formed a drafting committee that included people from different backgrounds with long professional or voluntary expertise. Some of them have a legal experience or documentation of human rights violation or have personal experiences, since some of them were actually victims or survivors or relatives of people who went missing. Of course, after preparing the first draft of the charter, it has been circulated on the PSG members, and it has been discussed and reviewed according to their comments. It has also been shared with a number of experts who joined the group and other experts who regularly cooperate with the ICMP. They have sent their comments and their suggestions, and it enriched the. They've been reflected in the charter, which has been enriched by them. Of course, some of the PSG members participated in drafting the charter, and those will present the charter with you. We will begin with our friend Ali Azir. Ali will introduce the compelling reasons for this charter and its importance in the Syrian framework and how it will be implemented by the various stakeholders. Ali is a lawyer, a Syrian lawyer with a very long experience in the field of transitional justice in Syria and in training survivors and educating them about their rights. Please go ahead, Ali. Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, Nael, and welcome, Reem. Because there is a very big number of missing people in Syria, it was very important, or it was normal to have many organizations documenting the names of the missing persons and many bodies working on it. And of course, every body and every organization has a specific mode of operating. Therefore, we thought it was important to have a charter to ensure that there is a minimum minimum ethics that are respected and observed when dealing with families of the victims. Also, we found it very important to have this charter because it is important to have some kind of coordination mechanism between the organizations working on documenting and the families of the missing, because we do not want to have duplication in efforts, and we want to save the families the agony of having to go through the experience again. Working in this field without the minimum ethics will definitely affect the victims and their families. Also, the interviews that were being held with the families of the missing at one point, we noticed that the people who were conducting the interviews lacked the necessary knowledge or training about how to conduct these interviews, how to assess the needs of the victims, and how to respond to their needs as a priority. Therefore, the lack of experienced and trained people led in a way or another to incurring more damage on the interviewees and the information or the data that was being collected. Also, obtaining the informed consent was a very important factor, because without the lack of this consent or lack of knowledge about how to obtain this consent meant that we had consents that we couldn't use at certain points to ensure justice. Also, using methods or techniques that lacked professionality or raising the expectations of the victims was also one of the very important things that required us or drove us to think about developing such charter. It is also important to mention that maintaining the privacy and secrecy of the collected data and the locations in which the data was collected or kept was very important, because the lack of very strict measures about the secrecy of data would weaken the data and would mean that that using this data would be inadmissible in some forums or some tribunals or courts, and this and the failure in responding to stigma, especially in cases that are related to sexual violence, was one of the reasons that drove us to create such a charter, and also the importance of catering to the psychosocial needs of the victims, and our awareness that neglecting such needs would lead to more damage. This led us to focus on the charter. These in summary, are all the reasons that led us to work on this charter, to come up with a minimum set of rules that have to be observed when we work with families of the missing people who can use these principles and this charter. This is important by the missing, the victims and their families. Any organization or anybody that work with the families of the missing and the victims will need to observe the principles listed in this charter. Also, the organizations that work in documentation have to include this charter in their bylaws and in their internal regulations. That will be very useful. Also, organizations that provide referral services to the refugees and possibly victims can also benefit from this charter. This charter includes a number of commitments that should be respected by the organizations that sign it. Some of these commitments is to include or to add some amendments to the bylaws and regulations in a way to ensure the respect of the principles mentioned in this charter and their regulations. Also, this charter this charter requires the signing or the member organizations to have a complaint system that would allow submitting complaints regarding any error in the regulations or any violation of these principles, and a way or a method to process these complaints. And also the organizations that sign this charter will disseminate it and post it on their websites and social media as a way to declare their commitment to this charter or their adherence to this charter. Also, the organizations that adopt this charter are aware that this charter can be developed further. It is the basic foundation or the minimum set of rules that can be developed and changed later on. It is very important to mention that we aspire that the funding or donor organizations that work with the victims and their families that would require the grant the organizations that receive grants to sign this charter before they receive their grants. Also, the donors and funders should provide the needed training to enable the organizations from implementing this charter and respect the principles included within. So this is what we have achieved. This is what we wanted to achieve so far. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ali, very much. As you mentioned, this charter targets local and international stakeholders, Syrian and non-Syrian alike, and donor organization, and it includes 11 principles that stem out of what Ali said regarding the such a charter. The first one has to do with prioritizing the rights of victims. And since this principle is the most important in this document and it's the cornerstone of it, we all agreed to list it as the first principle in the charter. What we mean by prioritizing the rights of victims is that the primary objective of any organization working in this field should aim to have the restoration of rights of the victims and abducted and to achieve justice. As for the second principle, a clear objective and a defined strategy and a legal framework when they working in documentation or collecting or data collection, including, and this should go hand in hand with the first principle. The third principle is about safeguarding evidence, and this is also linked to the first two principles, which means that prior to collecting data, the organization should ensure that it can do so while safeguarding evidence and sorting data securely, because there are many risks like damaging the evidence or endangering the witnesses or the victims. Fourth principle is transparency. The organization working in this field should be able to provide comprehensive information for the victims or the witnesses, including the name of the organization, the people who are documenting, taking the information, the purpose of taking this information, because the data donors have been faced a lot. Have faced a lot of risks and their life were put in their danger. They should also inform them about the steps of taking of the confidentiality measures. The fifth principle is the informed consent, and it has to cover all the steps from collecting the information, the recordings, and they all before doing any interview or taking any information, we have to take the informed consent and to And this is important if we want to use the information with any other organization or platform. And if we intend to do so, if we intend to share the information with any other organization, we have to inform the data donors. Also, the confidentiality, the information shall be kept in a confidential or stored in a confidential location, and the identity of the data donors should be kept anonymous unless we have their consent. The seventh principle is do no harm. The safety of the victim witness is very important, and it should be taken into consideration at all time. All people involved in the documentation process should be informed about the do no harm, including the translators and interpreters. As for the other principles, I will give the microphone now to Seema Nassar, the PSG member and a member in the drafting committee, and she participated in drafting this charter. Seema Nassar is a human rights defender and activist. She has a very long experience in working with the detainees and the missing and how this issue affects women and children. Seema, please go ahead. Thank you very much, Nael. Thank you very much, Ali and Reem. And I would like to welcome all the participants. I want to go to the eighth principle, which is sensitivity and appropriate treatment. With the stakeholders. We often receive complaints from the families of the victims complaining about the attitude or the conduct of the documenters and the data collectors. It is very important to remember that the detainees and the forcibly disappeared, they are not numbers, they are people with lives and people who left them. Therefore, we have to be sensitive when we talk to the families of the victims with the families of the missing. We have to respect their pain and their agony, and we have to give them all the information about the documentation, who's documenting, who's taking the information, what is the purpose of collecting this information, what are the parties that can use it, and why are we doing this. And at the same time, we have to give them the right to refuse to answer some of the questions that they find sensitive, because some of the families refuse to disclose that their son or their daughter is an activist or a member of an armed group, because they think that this would mean that we will lose interest in finding out, in revealing their fate, or they would believe that this would be used as evidence against them. We have to clarify to them that we want to do is to try to reveal their fate and to document the victims. We do not have to pressure them. We also have to explain to them that if they relocated or decided to go back to Syria, or if they found themselves at risk again, they can withdraw their consent to use the information. All this, all these details need to be clarified to the interviewees. This would help in building the trust between the documenting organizations and the families of the missing and the detainees, and sometimes the survivors or the survivors themselves. The number 9, neutrality and non-discrimination. Unfortunately, neutrality in Syria is very difficult to observe. We often mix up between neutrality and or we do not understand neutrality and objectivity, and it seems to us that we do not have a position against a criminal or a certain body, and it is very important to separate between the political positions and beliefs and the documentation process. And we should not mix up between our political positions and the victims or the perpetrators. Unfortunately, in Syria, many of the data collectors surprise you for the reasons they give for refusing to document some of the cases. For example, many times I was working with people and I knew that they were trustworthy, and if they were not trustworthy they wouldn't have said that. They would say that we did not document this person because he's an Alawite or he is Kurdish or he's not with the revolution. Why do you want to document his case? Or he is an ally of the regime. We need to separate our personal alliances from documentation. The Syrian people have suffered significantly from forcible disappearances and detentions. And if we want to get rid of this, and if we want to put an end to this phenomena in Syria, it is very important to ensure that the documenters do not violate the rights of any missing person. And documentation is very important, or it's the first step for any change. Therefore, we have to remain neutral. Number 10, protection of women. The Charter says that it is important to respect women's rights at all stages of data collection. And personally, I say that any organization or anybody that does not have the trained personnel that can respond to the needs of women who have gone through this experience, please don't document. I'm not saying, or I'm not assuming that any woman who went through disappearance or detention are difficult to deal with. On the contrary, some of them are capable of talking about their experiences very openly and very bravely. Some are not, but in all cases, the data collector should have the experience and should have the necessary knowledge to ensure that they don't that they don't cause any additional harm to these women later on, or any further trauma. Also, data collectors or documenters should both be men and women. Sometimes the women survivors are more comfortable speaking to women or men. So being able to respond to their needs is very important, and the necessary training to do so, that very important. And also they should be sensitive. They should be aware of the importance of confidentiality, and they should know how sensitive this issue is to women, especially with the stigma associated with detention. In order to get over that, we have to be very careful. We have to be very careful and determined not to cause any further damage that could be caused out of good intentions. Unfortunately, out of experience, I can tell you that the victims of sexual violence or gender-based violence were ready to talk with Human Rights Watch, but not the Syrian network. I'm just giving these as examples. I'm not criticizing anyone. They would choose to work with dignity, but not awesome, because they believe that if they work with Syrian organizations, then their story will be known among Syrians, and that's why they avoid working with them. Therefore, it is very important to have trained staffs who are aware of the importance of confidentiality and how to deal with women. The last principle is familiarity with the Syrian context. All the previous principles apply to international and local organizations, but I think that this principle is more focused or targets international organizations, and but also the local ones, because between the different regions in Syria there are a lot of differences and cultural differences in customs and traditions, and the incidents that happened there. Why are people being detained? What is the background of the people who are detained? It's very important to be familiar with the context, the cultural complications and specifics. We have to understand the place or the region we are working in, and wherever we go to work, we have to have an idea about what was written on this person on Facebook or social media. We have to be able to reassure the family that we are interested in this person as a person, and we are here to document their case. And of course, this will contribute to building trust between the two sides. These are all the principles that we have agreed on. But I would like to add that I think, in principle, we are all agree on these principles, but on the ground, very few organizations respect some of these principles, not even all of them. So it is very important to disseminate this charter as much as possible, and to look into the work of the organizations. And we should not be reluctant to say that we need capacity building. Some people say that it is a shame that after 10 years of the crisis, we are still working on the charter, although it is supposed to be one of the ABC of working in the documentation field. But on the contrary, I say that this is very important. This charter came as a result of our experience, our 10-year experience. There are still human rights violations. There are new organizations emerging in this field. Therefore, it is very important to avoid making the same mistakes and to learn from the mistakes of the others. That's why this charter is important. And always, as Dr. Nael said, prioritizing the interest of the victims and the survivors remains to be, or prioritizing the rights of the victims remains to be the most important thing. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Seema. Nael, would you like to add anything?
تمام تمام
Thank you. That's all we had to say.
To Nael, to Ali, and to Seema for providing a background and the reasons for the ethical charter, as well as discussing in detail the 11 principles and providing even real life examples of why these principles are important and why the PCG came up with these principles. To just continue the discussion on the ethical charter, I want to introduce Dr. Stephen Heidemann. He is one of the 4 PCG experts and advisors, and he supported also in the drafting and review of the ethical charter. He's a political scientist who has studied, taught, and written about Syria for more than 30 years. From 2007 to 2015, he held a number of leadership positions at the US Institute of Peace in Washington, DC, including Vice President of Applied Research on Conflict and Senior Advisor for the Middle East. He also currently serves as the vice chair of the board of the Day After, a Syrian-led NGO that works to build the democratic capacity of civil society in Syria and within Syrian refugee communities. Dr. Heidemann is one of the 4 PCG international experts and advisors, along with Patrick Croker from the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, ECCHR, Agneta Johansson from the International Legal Assistance Consortium, ILAC, and Justine De Mayo from the Act for the Disappeared. Dr. Stephen.
Thank you very much, Reem. Thank you. I'm really very honored to have the chance to participate in this launch event, and I want to extend not only my thanks but also my gratitude to the ICMP and in particular to the very, very dedicated staff and members of the Syria Policy Coordination Group for the work that they've done over the past months in putting this ethical charter together. It's the first time, and I don't think we can overestimate the importance of this development, but this is the first time that we now have in place essential principles and criteria that we've heard about from our previous speakers that should govern and inform how we undertake the critical work of advancing accountability and justice for the tens of thousands, the 100,000 Syrians detained or missing as a result of the conflict that Syria has experienced over the past decade. But also, and I think this is equally important, as a result of earlier abuses, earlier criminality at the hands of the Syrian regime over the past half century. Those victims as well should not be forgotten, and they are included within the scope of the ethical charter, which I think is singularly significant. Now, the charter itself, I think, is a major achievement in its own right, and you've heard about some of the reasons why that's the case from our previous speakers this morning on my part. But I want to suggest very briefly some reasons why I think the launch of the Charter has much broader importance for work in our field. And I'll mention only 3 reasons, although I think there are many more. First, I think we have to recognize that the Charter represents really a crucial step forward in the development of a global framework of norms and practices and standards to guide how governments and NGOs pursue efforts to secure justice and accountability for the missing and detained in ways that preserve trust between victims and those who act on their behalf. And we've heard this morning about some of the reasons why that trust is frayed, and the standards and principles in this charter can go a long way toward restoring that very important element of trust. Second, I think this charter underscores that the goals of accountability and justice can only be advanced when the governments and organizations involved in this work are themselves held accountable for how they conduct themselves. Accountability is not only a matter for perpetrators, it must also be a crucial part of those who are doing the essential work of acting on behalf of victims and their families. It's very difficult to have organizations and governments claiming to give voice to victims when they act in ways that don't reflect the interests and the perspectives and the sensitivities and experiences of those victims. Third, and finally, I don't think we can overlook how important it is that the Charter was the result of a Syrian-led process, and that's been emphasized a number of times already today. And we can't underestimate the importance that the principles it sets out grow out of the lived experiences of people who are themselves, in many cases, victims and survivors who've paid a very heavy price simply for the crime of daring to imagine a different and a better future for Syria and for Syrians. And this model of working first and foremost from the perspectives and experiences and the lessons very painfully learned by those affected by conflict in the development of principles and standards, I hope would become a model that could be followed by other communities who are wrestling with similar kinds of challenges in their own contexts. And so I want to thank the Policy Coordination Group, congratulate the Syrian members of the PCG in particular for their leadership in the development of this charter. Now, as we've heard already from Ms. Nasser, there's still an enormous amount of work ahead of us. Many organizations are not aware of these standards yet, are not aware yet of the charter. It's one of the reasons why this launch is so important. But I want to emphasize the urgency now of moving beyond having developed this charter to seeing it become the standard practice, accepted and adopted and implemented by all of the groups involved in work on missing and detained in Syria. I think we will all benefit the more we can ensure that the work that is done on the ground reflects the very important principles that this committee, this group of dedicated individuals have devoted themselves to developing over the course of the past several months. Thank you again for giving me the chance to be part of this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stephen. Before I move on, I just want to make sure that the translator is doing, the translation is coming out clear. Hopefully there's no issues. Okay, great. So thank you so much, Dr. Stephen Heidemann, for your words. As the next speaker, I would like to introduce Mr. Andreas Kleiser, who is the International Commission for Missing Persons Director for Policy and Coordination, to speak a few words about ICMP and the PCG process. Andreas?
Yes, thank you very much, Reem. Welcome, everybody. I'm speaking on behalf of Director General Catherine Bomberger, who is unfortunately not able to make it today at this time. She would have loved to be with the group for this meeting. Now, first I need to resound some of the statements made by Stephen and congratulate the PCG for this remarkable achievement of the Charter, which fits perfectly well and promotes and will, we hope, very much advance the future efforts of addressing the issue of missing and disappeared persons from the Syrian conflict. Now, from an ICMP perspective, speaking very generally, addressing the issue of missing persons in a legal and rule of law manner constitutes an investment in peace. And data collection is the first step. And the Charter, of course, helps to ensure the legality and also the usefulness of the data that's being collected. And indeed, in that it builds trust or preserves trust, or as was stated, may help to restore trust. It will, of course, also functionally facilitate that process. Now, it does set certain standards, and these standards have been vetted. They have been vetted by various experts. They have been reviewed extensively in the PCG. They have been compared to other international norms, such as the European Data Protection Regulation, which does also constitute a global standard. Since we are speaking about personal data, that's an important element. So we can now see that on the basis of that charter, we have a set of principles that have already, at least within the realm of collecting data as the first step in that investment to peace, collecting data in the Syrian context, whether inside Syria, in the neighboring countries, but also say in Europe, where ICMP is commencing with data collection efforts and even reference sample, genetic reference sample collection efforts, that we have a convergence we have convergent standards now how we can do this. I mean, we can comply with what is called the GDPR on the one hand, and we also have a buy-in for that particular standard of work. So that is of incredible importance, and I very much also want to resound that I think we have legitimate expectations that the standard will have, the Charter will have a broad acceptance since ICMP, and I'm happy to announce that, of course, ICMP has already put the Charter on its webpage. Its principles are incorporated in ICMP's data processing and protection rules, and that is also something that we pass on to our partners, civil society partners engaging in that field. So I think there is already a fertile ground for making this become a broadly referenced and observed instrument, and we will of course continue to monitor that, and with the help of the PCG, I think we also have an instrument to ensure or improve compliance over the time to come. But I would also like to point out that it gives guidance not only to reference sample or data collection efforts and in relations with family members. It also gives guidance to recipients of training, for instance, in the forensic field, whether in Raqqa or elsewhere. So it is very important to see that it is a tool that can be promoted through training activities, and as you're aware, ICMP has been supporting civil society organizations through small grants, but also technical training, as well as legal training, where again we will reference the Charter as one of the instruments to turn to, so to give it the adequate visibility, and also understanding why it is important that partner organizations adopt under their respective legal frameworks the Charter or its principles. Now, to go back to the PCG and to just recall that, I mean, it was of course set up in May 2019, and has been working through plenary sessions, and during the pandemic, of course, also online sessions. And the Charter constitutes, I believe, a very significant direct outcome of that process, of which I mean, I have to say also ICMP is very proud to have been able to support and facilitate that, since it shows the great utility of the PCG as it moves forward with further developing policy outlines that can support an eventual peace process in respect of the missing, where of course the missing not only one prominent item, but probably one of the most critical issue if public institutions that may emerge from such a process shall enjoy the credibility of Syrians, whether they're inside Syria, in neighboring countries, or refugees in Europe and in elsewhere. So In closing, I believe we're on Missing Persons Day. We have something very tangible to report, something that was indeed developed by Syrian civil society. At the same time, has conforms to such international standards that we have a very legitimate instrument. And finally, I very much, and all of ICMP, want to thank, of course, the European Union for supporting the PCG, and in particular the process of developing the charter. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andreas. And speaking of the EU, I'd like to now introduce Mr. Marcus Lapine, who is the EU's delegation to Syria's head of cooperation. Marcus.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Reem and Andreas, and the entire ICMP team for the kind invitation to this event, and of course to Nail, Ali, Seema, and Stephen for their insights as well into the work of the Policy Coordination Group. My name is Marcus. I'm the head of the Development Cooperation section at the EU. As Reem just said, it's my pleasure to speak briefly, and I really promise it's going to be briefly, at this important launch event, and to be part of the discussions that will evolve. The EU has repeatedly called for an end of the unacceptable violence in Syria, and is determined to continue to work to help ensure accountability for war crimes, human rights violations and abuses, and violations of international humanitarian law. In 2020, UN estimates indicated that over 130,000 persons are detained or missing as a result of the horrendous conflict in Syria. And Seema mentioned the protection of women's rights as a very important issue, and I think this pillar 8 of the Charter, the protection of women's rights, is a very important pillar in general of the EU's work, and also on the missing file. For us, women constitute a minority of the missing, but are the majority of the family members who endure severe long-term social, economic, but also legal and psychological stress because of everything that happens around the missing. Syrian families of the missing, especially those headed by women, often do not know about the whereabouts, of course, of the missing person and struggle to receive comprehensive support. That is the support the EU is committed to offer to support also in the future. Overall, and in this slide, the EU has been supporting the ICMP since 2017. Our project now aims at building capacity of civil society organization and family of the missing and other key actors to advocate for resolution of missing persons cases and to promote for collaboration between governments, between international organizations and other actors on the missing persons issue, because we deem that is a crucial part that needs to be done. It's in the framework of this project that the EU welcomes today the launch of the Charter. We commend the efforts of all the members of the Policy Coordination Group in sharing the lessons learned as well from years of experience working on the issues and jointly drafting such a relevant document. We strongly uphold the guiding principles included in the Charter and really wish to congratulate all the PCG members for today's very important milestone. We believe that's an essential step to invest further in future peace, stability, and development. So really congratulations to all of you for that. And lastly, let me thank ICMP for the great efforts in gathering relevant stakeholders, the same table to explore ways to promote a common understanding on the way forward in addressing the issue of data collection and documentation. And I'm very much looking forward to be part now of all the discussions that will evolve further in this afternoon session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marcus. And thank you to all the speakers. Now it's the Q&A session. We have about 13 minutes before the end of this virtual launch. If you do have a question, you have the option of raising your hand, which I think is under the reactions button, or you can put the question in the chat box. So I'm just going to check very quickly if anyone has a raised hand. Okay. I don't see any hands yet. So I actually do have a question that maybe I can pose as an initial question. And in the meantime, if anyone else has questions, please raise your hand or write your question in the chat box. My question is for Ali, Seema, and Nail. As Stephen mentioned, and I know that during the drafting of the ethical charter, one of the most difficult issues was how do you translate the theory of the ethical charter and the principles to actual action. And Stephen talked about the importance of that. And that's something that we did talk about quite a bit. So Seema, Ali, and Nael, how do you see, I mean, how do we, moving forward, how do we translate these principles into action on the ground for documentation and data collection? And one thing that I do want to raise is within the ethical charter, there is a discussion of the role that donors and implementers should play in supporting the ethical charter financially. So maybe you can also touch upon that. I'll turn the floor to any one of you three to answer that.
سيما أو علي إذا ما حدا أنا بجاوب.
Seema and Ali, if you don't, I can answer if you like, or actually I will answer, and if you can continue afterwards. There several ideas were discussed about this topic, and we tried to summarize them or reflect them in the charter. Of course, organizations should voluntarily agree to adopt this charter and integrate it into its internal bylaws. Now, the problem is how to monitor the implementation and adherence, because it is not enough to amend their policies and harmonize them with this charter, but this is something that we can think about later as PSG, to create a monitoring committee that would monitor the adherence. Also, as stakeholders or organizations that are in constant contact with the families of with the victims and the families of the missing, we have to work on disseminating this charter, and this is the most important factor, ensuring that it would turn into action on the ground. So it is very important that all organizations working in this field would adopt this charter and work on implementing it on the ground. This is my answer. Nael, I don't know if you would like to add something else. Seema wants to add something to what Ali said, is that the most useful thing here, because we do not have the power to commit any organization to abide by these principles, the most important thing that we can do is to raise awareness. This is what we can do, because when the families of the missing and the researchers know about it, hear about these principles, learn this information, and that this is something that should be respected in the documentation process, this will drive people and organizations to abide by the principles mentioned in this charter and to adopt the charter, because people will stand against the organizations if they do not implement the charter's principles. So awareness, regardless regardless of the organizations that adopt the charter, the content of the charter should be disseminated, should be made known to the people. In the past, or at the beginning of the crisis, the Syrian people were not aware of such principles, but now you hear complaints from them. They doubt some organizations, and I receive calls from some of them that this organization said so and so, and I feel that this is not right, or this is a violation. So they do have the knowledge, and we need to help them with that. Maybe we can organize seminars, any education activities. It would create the needed knowledge among the people and among the target groups, and this would drive all the organizations working in this field to adhere to the principles mentioned or contained in this charter. Thank you very much, Seema. One last thing I would like to add is that I believe that their answers were comprehensive, but one more thing I would like to add, it is very important to raise the awareness or disseminate the culture, make the principles included here known to the people, because there are international mechanisms and implementation mechanisms, and the violations of these mechanisms should be should be learned by the people. And we mentioned in our discussions that organizations that adopt this charter should train its staff on how to implement the principles. And I think that disseminating the culture and raising awareness will have very positive results on the ground. Thank you very much, Ali Sima Naal.
I'm just checking now to see if there's any other questions. I don't see any hands, and there's no questions in the chat box. We are near the hour, so I think that should be fine. I think just as a last before then I close up, unless there's any final hands. Okay. Before I close up, I did want to just mention, in addition to the ethical charter, just as a background on the work of the PCG, beyond the incredible work that the PCG has done on developing this ethical charter, the PCG has submitted last month a report to the Universal Periodic Review of Syria, focused on discussing the missing and the disappeared and detained, looking not only at the current context and the situation, but also at the institutions and the laws presently in Syria that only exacerbate the situation of detention and missing in Syria. It is available, I believe, on the ICMP website, amongst other websites. You are welcome to review it, check it out. It's a very comprehensive report. In addition, currently the PCG is working on developing constitutional principles and recommendations that we hope to feed into the peace process, not only the constitutional drafting process, but other processes. And these constitutional principles and recommendations will be specific to missing persons, detainees that disappeared. And in future months, we hope the PCG, we will be working on developing legislation and institutions, policy frameworks and recommendations for future Syria following any sort of peace settlement. And so please stay in tune. We will definitely be having more of these launch events introduced of the PCG. I really do want to thank the members of the policy coordination group for their incredible work, the many hours they have spent in developing the ethical charter and the other activities that I've just mentioned. It's a very difficult topic, as was mentioned, the issue of missing and disappeared. It remains one of the most pressing issues in the Syrian conflict. And so the work that's being done on this, I think, is extremely important and timely. I want to thank all the attendees again for joining us in this virtual launch. And hopefully, as I said, we will have more of these launches as the PCG continues its work and its efforts to introduce you to the work of the PCG. And the last thing I do want to say is that the ethical charter, as Andreas has mentioned, is currently on the ICMP website. It's both in Arabic and English. It was shared in the chat box if you haven't seen it already, and it was also sent via email. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to the speakers. And I hope you have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.